The flowers were still fresh. The chairs were perfectly arranged in long white rows. The smell of roses filled the entire hall. Outside, guests were arriving in suits and dresses, laughing, taking photos, celebrating what was supposed to be the happiest day of our family's life. I was standing near the entrance, adjusting my tie, feeling proud. My wife, Margaret, the woman who had given 42 years of her life to our family, was standing beside me in her pale blue dress. She had cried getting ready that morning. Not from sadness, from joy. She had always dreamed of seeing our son Daniel married. She had prayed for it. She had planned for it. She had sewn small, hand-stitched details into the decorations herself because she wanted everything to be perfect for him. And then, in front of 37 guests, with the wedding just 40 minutes from beginning, the bride walked up to my wife, looked her up and down like she was looking at furniture, and said, and I will never forget these words for the rest of my life, she said, "Margaret, the bathroom near the bridal suite is a little messy. Can you go clean it up?" The cleaning staff missed it. "You don't mind, do you?" There was a pause. A long, terrible pause. My wife looked at her. I looked at my son. My son, Daniel, 31 years old. The boy I had worked overtime every weekend for 20 years to provide for. Stood right there and said absolutely nothing. And that was the moment everything changed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cause a scene. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and I smiled. Let me tell you the whole story. Because what happened next, what I had quietly prepared months before this wedding even began, is something neither of them ever saw coming. My name is Harold. I'm 68 years old. I was born in a small town in Ohio to a father who worked in a steel mill and a mother who cleaned houses for other families to help pay the bills. We were not wealthy people. We were not connected people. What we had was work ethic and love, and a belief that if you sacrificed enough, life would be kind to the ones you built it for. I met Margaret when I was 23. She was waitressing at a diner near the college. I'd barely managed to enroll in on a partial scholarship. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, not just in her face, though she was lovely, but in her spirit. She had a warmth that filled every room she walked into. She smiled at people like they mattered, like they were worth seeing. I fell in love with her in 3 weeks, and I've never stopped. We married young. We had very little. I was working days at a parts factory and taking 2-night classes at community college, trying to finish a degree in accounting. Margaret worked full-time as a waitress and, later, as a school cafeteria cook. There was a period, I will be honest, where we ate rice and canned beans for dinner 4 nights a week, because that was what we could afford. But we never complained to each other. We held hands and kept going. Daniel was born when I was 26. He was the light of our lives. I remember the night we brought him home from the hospital. I sat in the rocking chair next to his crib, and I made him a silent promise. I told him, without words, just in my heart, I will give you everything I never had. I will make sure you never know what struggle feels like. I will work until my hands bleed so that your hands never have to. And I kept that promise. I finished my degree. I climbed my way into a mid-level accounting position at a regional firm. Margaret stopped waitressing and became the heart of our home, raising Daniel with patience and tenderness and more love than I can describe with words. We eventually bought a small house, nothing fancy, in a quiet neighborhood. Daniel had his own room, his own bicycle, a warm coat every winter, and parents who showed up to every single school event without exception. As Daniel grew older, things got better financially. By the time he was in high school, I'd been promoted twice, and Margaret had gone back to part-time work as a bookkeeper for a local church. We were comfortable, not rich, but comfortable. And we were happy. Daniel was a smart kid, driven, ambitious in ways that impressed me. He got into a good university on a combination of merit scholarship and, I'll be honest, a significant contribution from our savings. We didn't mind. We were proud. He graduated with a degree in business management, got a good job in the city, and began building a life that looked, from the outside, very successful. And then he met Vanessa. Vanessa came into Daniel's life about 3 years ago. She was beautiful, confident, and came from what she liked to describe as a good family, by which she meant a family with money. Her father owned a chain of dry cleaning businesses. Her mother sat on 2 charity boards and made sure everyone in the room knew it. From the very first dinner we had together, I could sense something. Margaret, who always sees the best in people, warmed to Vanessa quickly. She complimented her dress, asked about her family, offered second helpings of everything. Vanessa was polite, technically. She smiled at the right moments, said the right things, but there was something behind her eyes when she looked at Margaret, and at me, and at our modest home. Something that wasn't quite respect. I noticed it. I said nothing. I told myself I was being an overprotective father. Over the next year, the small signs became harder to ignore. Vanessa would make comments, always wrapped in a smile, always deniable, about our neighborhood, our furniture, our lifestyle. Once when Margaret served a home-cooked pot roast that she had spent all afternoon preparing, Vanessa said, "Oh, how rustic. I love that you still cook like this." She said it like a compliment. It wasn't one. Daniel noticed none of it. Or perhaps he noticed and chose not to see it. He was in love, and love, as I know better than most, can make you temporarily blind to things you should be watching. The engagement was announced 18 months ago. Vanessa's parents immediately began dominating the wedding planning. Her mother, Patricia, took charge of the venue, the catering, the guest list. Margaret was consulted occasionally, where you might consult a neighbor before making a small decision, but her suggestions were rarely taken seriously. She endured this gracefully because Margaret has always been graceful. She swallowed her hurt and focused on being supportive. I, meanwhile, was paying. Let me be clear about that. Daniel and Vanessa had their own income, yes, but the wedding budget, the venue deposit, the catering contract, the floral arrangements, the photographer, the rehearsal dinner, the vast majority of it was funded by a transfer I made from my retirement account. Nearly $60,000. I wrote every check myself. I signed every contract myself, because I wanted my son's wedding to be perfect, because that's what fathers do. Vanessa's family contributed toward the honeymoon and the bridal suite accommodations. For this, Patricia reminded us approximately every third conversation. We're handling the honeymoon. Of course, she would say, as though this was a sacrifice of enormous proportion. In the weeks before the wedding, the dynamic became more uncomfortable. Vanessa began giving Margaret small, demeaning assignments. "Margaret, can you address these extra invitations? Your handwriting is so quaint. Margaret, could you pick up the favor bags from the print shop? It's just a small errand." Margaret did all of it, without complaint, because she loved Daniel and wanted to be useful. I watched this. I kept watching, and quietly, privately, I began to prepare. I said nothing to Margaret. I didn't want to upset her or cause a conflict before the wedding. But I am an accountant by profession. I'm a man who reads contracts carefully, who understands exactly whose name is on what document, and who knows precisely what options are available when those documents need to change. I made one very quiet phone call 6 weeks before the wedding. And then I waited. Before I tell you what happened at that wedding, if this story is speaking to something in your heart, please take one moment and hit that subscribe button below and ring that notification bell. I share true life stories like this every single week. Stories about family, dignity, sacrifice, and justice. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let me tell you exactly what happened in that hall. The morning of the wedding was beautiful. Spring sunlight, a light breeze, everything picture perfect. Margaret was radiant in her blue dress. I watched her look at herself in the mirror and adjust her pearl earrings, the ones I gave her on our 25th anniversary. And I felt a surge of love for her so powerful it almost hurt. We arrived at the venue early to help with final preparations. Margaret carried a small box of handmade centerpiece editions. She had stayed up until midnight crafting tiny folded paper cranes, an old tradition she remembered from a book she loved. She had made 67 of them by hand. Vanessa looked at the paper cranes when Margaret presented them and said, "Oh, we have a theme, Margaret. These don't really fit, but thank you." She set the box to the side without looking at it again. Margaret nodded and smiled and said, "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you need." I watched my wife's face as she turned away. For just 1/2 second before she composed herself, I saw something in her eyes that broke my heart completely. She looked like a woman who had spent her whole life giving and had just been told, quietly, efficiently, without drama, that what she gave wasn't good enough. I put my hand on her back and said nothing. 40 minutes before the ceremony, as guests were arriving and music was playing softly through the hall speaker system, Vanessa appeared from the corridor that led to the bridal suite. She was in her wedding gown. She looked stunning, I will give her that. She walked directly to where Margaret was standing near the guest book table and spoke loudly enough for several guests nearby to hear. "Margaret," she said, her voice bright and firm, "the bathroom near the bridal suite is a little messy. Can you go clean it up?" The cleaning staff missed it. "You don't mind, do you?" The guests near the table heard. I saw 2 of them exchange a look. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. I looked at Daniel. He was standing 8 feet away. He had heard every word. He adjusted his cufflink and looked at the floor. That was the moment. I reached into my jacket pocket. I pulled out my phone. I pulled up the contact I'd saved 6 weeks ago, the wedding venue coordinator, a kind woman named Brenda, whom I had spoken to privately on multiple occasions. I had her personal number because, as the primary contract holder for this event, I had established that relationship deliberately and carefully. I walked a few steps away from the crowd. I dialed. Brenda answered on the second ring. "Brenda," I said quietly, "this is Harold. I need to invoke the cancellation clause on the contract. Today's event. Full cancellation." There was a pause on her end. "Harold, the ceremony is in 40 minutes. "I know," I said. "I'm aware. The contract permits primary holder cancellation with 7 days' notice, or on-site cancellation for documented cause. I'm invoking documented cause. I'll explain when we speak in person. Can you meet me near the entrance?" Another pause. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. I hung up. I stood there for a moment, breathing steadily, looking at the flowers and the white chairs and the guests who had no idea what was about to happen. Then I walked to the catering coordinator, a man named Frank who ran the kitchen crew, and I told him to put everything on hold until further notice. I was the contract holder. He nodded, confused, and stepped away to relay the message. Then I walked back to where Margaret was still standing, still composed, still enduring. I took her hand. I looked at Vanessa. I looked at my son. "Daniel," I said very calmly, "I need to speak with you outside." He followed. Vanessa followed. We stepped through the side doors into the courtyard. "Dad, what is this about?" Daniel said, already defensive, already sensing something. I looked at him for a long moment. "Your fiancé just asked your mother, who made 67 paper cranes by hand, who spent 3 days addressing envelopes, who has done nothing but love and support this wedding from the moment you announced it, to go clean a toilet in front of guests on your wedding day." Daniel opened his mouth. "Dad, it wasn't—" "You were standing 8 feet away," I said. "You heard it. And you said nothing." Silence. "I have been funding this wedding," I continued. "The venue, the catering, the flowers, the photographer, the rehearsal dinner. $60,000 from my retirement savings, Daniel. Every contract is in my name. I made sure of that 6 weeks ago, after a particularly unpleasant evening. I called Brenda at the venue and reviewed the cancellation terms. Just in case." Vanessa's face had changed. The brightness was gone. "I am canceling the wedding," I said. "Not out of anger, not as a punishment, but because my wife deserves to be treated with dignity. And because my son, who I sacrificed my retirement savings to celebrate, chose to look at the floor when his mother was humiliated." Daniel found his voice. "You can't just— Dad, there are 120 people in there." "There are," I agreed. "And Brenda is handling the logistics as we speak. Guests will be informed there has been a family emergency and the event cannot proceed today. The catering staff will be paid in full regardless. That is already in the contract. The venue will retain The minimum required and refund. The balance per the cancellation clause I negotiated when I signed. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a dramatic man. I'm not a man who makes speeches. What I said next, I said quietly, and I said it only once. You have a choice, Daniel. You can walk back into that hall with your bride and explain to your mother, in front of everyone if you wish, that she is valued in this family, that what just happened was wrong, that you are sorry. If you do that, genuinely, from your heart, I will call Brenda back and we will proceed. That is option one. I looked at Vanessa. And that apology needs to come from you too, sincerely, not as a performance. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Vanessa crossed her arms. This is insane, she said. You're ruining our wedding over nothing. In Daniel, my son, my boy, the child, I'd rocked to sleep and worked weekends for and believed in with everything. I had just looked at his bride. And then he looked at me, and he said, Dad, you're overreacting. I nodded slowly. Okay, I said. I dialed Brenda back. What followed was one of the strangest afternoons of my life. Guests were informed, gently and professionally, that a family situation had arisen and the ceremony would not be proceeding. Some were confused. Some were kind. Vanessa's mother especially, were furious, in a way that reminded me exactly of where Vanessa had learned her particular brand of contempt. Margaret did not know what I had done until Brenda came to the guest book table and began speaking quietly with the staff. Margaret looked at me from across the room, and I walked to her, and I took her hand and I said, We're going home. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said quietly, Harold, you didn't have to. Yes, I told her, I did. We drove home in silence for the first 20 minutes. Then Margaret began to cry, not loudly, just quietly, the way she does, the way she has always cried, with dignity, letting the tears come without making them a performance. I kept my hand on hers the entire drive. When we got home, we sat on the porch. It was late afternoon by then, the light turning gold across the yard. I made us both a cup of tea. We sat there together, and I thought about all the years, the rice and beans years, the overtime years, the proud years, the hard years, and I thought about how this woman beside me had walked through every single one of them, without once asking for more than I could give. She deserved better than a toilet assignment on her son's wedding day. She deserved better than a daughter-in-law who saw her as staff. She deserved better than a son who stared at the floor. Daniel called that evening, then called again, then came to the house 2 days later. I let him in. I listened. He was angry at first, about the money, about the guests, about the embarrassment. Slowly, over the course of an hour, the anger wore through to something underneath. Something younger, something that sounded by the end almost like remorse. He didn't apologize that day, but he came back a week later, and he apologized then. It was not a perfect apology. It was not the apology I might have written for him, but it was real. It was his own, and he apologized to his mother first, which is the only order that mattered. As for Vanessa, she and Daniel are still together as I write this. I won't pretend I know how that story ends. But I do know that something shifted. Something was made clear in that courtyard that had never been said plainly before. That Margaret's dignity is not negotiable. That my silence has limits. That the contracts in this family run deeper than money. And that I know how to read every clause. I do not regret what I did. Not for one moment. Some people told me I was wrong. That I should have talked privately, handled it quietly. Not embarrassed everyone, maybe. I've thought about that. But I want to ask you something. How many times do quiet conversations happen and nothing changes? How many times does a good woman smile and endure because she doesn't want to cause trouble? How many times is silence mistaken for acceptance? I had been quiet for 3 years. I had watched. I had waited. I had given every opportunity for things to improve. When Vanessa pointed at my wife and told her to clean a bathroom, there were 2 people in that corridor who needed to see that it was not acceptable. One was my son. The other, I think, was me. Margaret and I went out for dinner the following Friday, just the 2 of us, somewhere quiet and nice, a place we'd been meaning to try for years. She wore the blue dress. She ordered whatever she wanted. We held hands across the table like we used to when we were young and had nothing and were still the happiest people we knew. "You know," she said somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, "and this is the best wedding gift you've ever given me." I laughed. She laughed. And the sound of it, her laugh in that restaurant, on an ordinary Friday evening, was the best thing I'd heard in months. Here is what I learned, or perhaps what I remembered. A woman's dignity is not a small thing. A mother's sacrifice is not a decorative detail. And a man who looks at the floor when his wife is humiliated has already told you everything you need to know about the foundation being built. I spent 42 years building something solid. I know what a good foundation looks like. I know what it takes to maintain one. And I know, with all the certainty of a man who has been tested and did not crack, that the most important contract I ever signed was not the wedding venue agreement. It was the promise I made to a woman in a pale blue dress. That one I intend to honor until the very last day of my life. Our true life story. If you believe every mother deserves to be treated with dignity, drop a in the comments below. And if you think Harold did the right thing, type "cancelled with love." I read every single one.